Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the 2022 Senate map based on the betting markets. So the betting markets can be a pretty good way to analyze elections. For example, if you look at a state like Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes is leading in the poll by 1.4% and has been ahead for quite a while. However, according to the markets, he only still has a 40% chance at winning. Ron Johnson, the incumbent Republican, has a 63% chance at winning, despite being down in the poll. So the betting markets provide a much more realistic view of how these races are going to go, as of course people are betting their very own money, and the betting markets are not just based on polls, they're based on recent events as well as the strengths of each of these candidates. And so in this video we'll be going over the betting markets in every single one of the competitive Senate elections that we have this year. And so for margins, we'll be using the same ones that 538 uses. If a candidate has an over 95% chance at winning, it will make the race solid, and that's the states that we've already filled in. Likely is between 75 to 95, the lean range is from 60 to 75, and the toss-up range is of course from 50 to 60. So starting off with the state of Washington, we're going to start off with the upper left-hand corner and move all the way down to the lower right. Starting off with the race in Washington, though, Patty Murray is running for a second term, and she has a 93% chance at winning her 5th term in office. Tiffany Smiley is the top Republican right now, and she is not going to win this race. It will, in the end, come out to a victory for Patty Murray. She's ahead in the polls by 10.5%, is doing pretty solid in this election, and so there's really no doubt that Patty Murray is going to win, but the odds are just slightly under 95. Next up, we have a very competitive election in Nevada where Kathleen Cortez Masto is struggling to win a second full term in office. Adam Laxalt has a 49% chance at winning this race, and the odds did favor Laxalt for a pretty long time. At one point, he had an over 70% chance at defeating the incumbent Masto. Now Masto is favored, but by a very small margin. In the polls, she's up by 2.9% and has maintained a lead since late May. Even though Masto has been ahead, she is still very vulnerable. Polls are likely to overestimate Republicans here, though, as they did in 2018. So the numbers here are favorable for Masto overall, but a lot can change in the next 2 months, and that's why this is going to be one of the key races of the 2022 election cycle. I think that Nevada and Georgia are going to be the two races that end up deciding the makeup of the U.S. Senate and whether or not Democrats will be able to keep their majority. According to the 538 forecast, Masto has a 61% chance of winning, so 538 currently is more confident in Masto than the betting markets, but only by a very slight margin. But right now, the election in Nevada is closer than it has ever been, but Masto does have a very slight advantage, making the state a tilt race for the Democratic Party. Next up in Utah, we have a race that's surprisingly competitive, as Republicans only have an 87% chance at holding onto a seat in one of the most conservative states in the entire country. Mike Lee won his first election 6 years ago by 41%. Now he's only up in the polls by 7.3% against conservative independent Evan McMullin. And so Democrats did not run a candidate in this race, and so McMullin right now really does stand a chance against Mike Lee. Many of the most recent polls have suggested this race to be pretty close. Lee only led by 3 points in the most recent poll conducted by Center Street PAC. And so Evan McMullin right now really is making this race a lot more competitive than it should be, and that's why Utah is only a likely state for the GOP. This is definitely a race to watch in the coming weeks. Even though Mike Lee is heavily favored, the race can narrow up, and according to 538, Lee right now only has a 93% chance of winning, making Utah not even a solid state according to their forecast, even though it has been for quite a while. So Utah, for the first time, is going to be a likely state according to the betting market. And moving on to Arizona, we have the exact opposite of what Utah is turning out to be right now. Arizona is a surprisingly less competitive race than it seemed to be for a long time, and that's because Blake Masters became the Republican nominee. Blake Masters is a poor candidate. Republicans should not have chosen him, and so because of this choice by the Arizona Republican Party, right now Mark Kelly is heavily favored to win re-election to his first full term in office after winning his 2020 special election against incumbent Martha McSally. So Kelly won that race by 2.4%, but as of this point in time, he's leading in the polls by 8.6 points against Blake Masters. Now, in 2020, Kelly did underperform polling expectations, but he is doing better right now than he was 2 years ago. According to the betting markets, if you look at the overall trend here, for quite a while, Blake Masters was favored of whoever the Republican nominee was going to be. Mark Brnovich and Jim Layman both lost the GOP primary, and I think if any of those two candidates were nominated, especially Layman, Mark Kelly would be in a much more competitive election. 538 currently gives Kelly a 79% chance at winning his re-election. If you look at how the odds have changed, you will see a pretty similar story. Although 538 has always favored the Democratic incumbent, the odds right now for Mark Kelly are higher than they have ever been. This election went from being a 2-point race all the way now to being a 6-point race in favor of the Democratic Party. Mark Kelly has led in every single poll that has ever been released for the 2022 Senate election in Arizona, and that's why Arizona is going to be a lean state on our map according to the betting markets. It's almost a likely state if it just goes up to 75, but at this point it's still going to have that lean rating. In the state of Colorado, Michael Bennet is running for a second term in office, and he's currently being challenged by Republican Joe Dea. Now, Bennet was first appointed to become a member of the U.S. Senate in 2009, and then proceeded to win re-election in both 2010 and 2016. Most recently, 6 years ago, he won his second term by 5.7% against Darrell Glenn. Not exactly the strongest margin for Bennet, but he did still outperform Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. But of course, Colorado has become an even bluer state since his last win. In 2020, John Hickenlooper flipped this seat. Corey Gardner was the incumbent defending it in 2020, but Hickenlooper still almost won by a double-digit margin. Polls right now show Bennet ahead by 8.6% against the Republican nominee. Joe Dea is not that terrible of a candidate. He's much more moderate than many of the other GOP candidates that they're running in other states. And so Joe Dea does stand a chance in this race, but in the very end, he is still very likely to lose. Michael Bennet is a strong incumbent. He's popular in Colorado, and so Republicans are probably not going to win simply because Michael Bennet is a Democrat and, of course, a two-time incumbent. The betting markets have always been very favorable to Bennet here. Really no significant change in the last couple of months, and so Colorado is going to continue being a likely state. I think that the likely rating is correct for this race. I do not think that Michael Bennet is going to win by over 15%, but I also don't think his margin of victory is going to be under 5. And so now we've gone over the entire western half of the continental US, and we're going to move on to the 5 competitive races in the Midwest. So starting off with the election in Iowa, Chuck Grassley is in a surprisingly vulnerable position. He only has a 94% chance at winning his re-election to an 8th term, and so Chuck Grassley's age is going to be a major issue of this campaign. If Chuck Grassley wins in 2022 and serves all the way until 2029, that would be the full 6-year term that he would win. Chuck Grassley will be closer to 100 by the end of that term than he is to 90. Chuck Grassley is the oldest senator running for re-election this year by far, and he is vulnerable simply because of his age. If you look at the last couple elections for him in 2016, he won by 24 points. In 2010, it was a margin of 31 points, and in 2004, he won by 42%. I mean, you can go back to 1998 if you want as well, 38%. 1992, Grassley wins by 42. So elections in Iowa with Chuck Grassley in them have not been competitive for a very long time, but it is this year. Michael Franken is a former Navy Vice Admiral and is currently polling better than any other Democratic challenger to Chuck Grassley in the last 4 decades. Michael Franken is only down in the polls by 7.3%. If Chuck Grassley wins by this margin, it'll be a severe underperformance for the GOP, and in my opinion, Chuck Grassley is not going to get over a 15% margin. 538 though does disagree. They currently have Grassley winning by 17 points, giving him a 98% chance of winning, but in my opinion, I have Iowa currently as a likely Republican state, just like the betting markets. I think that Grassley will be able to win by over 10, but probably not 15. In the Missouri race, Republicans have a 94% chance at winning with Eric Schmidt as the new Republican nominee as Roy Blunt chooses to retire. So Democrats only have a 6% chance of winning with Judy Bush Valentine defeating Lucas Coons in the Democratic primary. But in 2016, we saw a pretty close race in Missouri. Roy Blunt only won his second term as the incumbent by 2.8%. Jason Kander, though, was a pretty good Democratic nominee. He ran a very strong campaign against an unpopular Republican incumbent, so So even though Missouri was solid for Donald Trump in the presidential race, in 2016, Roy Blunt only won by 2.8 in the Senate election. But we're probably not going to see the same thing this time around. In 2018, we saw Claire McCaskill lose to Josh Hawley by 5.8 points, and Claire McCaskill was running for her third term. In 2012, she was reelected by a solid margin, and this was the same year, of course, that Barack Obama won re-election. So in 2022, Missouri is still a very red state. The polls currently show Eric Schmidt leading over Bush Valentine. Basically, every single poll has Schmidt up by around double digits, and so in the end, I think that Schmidt can win by double-digit margin. I think the polls right now are underestimating Republicans in the state, but according to the betting markets, the state of Missouri is going to be likely for the GOP. 538, though, just like Iowa, has it as a pretty solid state for the Republicans, with Eric Schmidt having a 98% chance at defeating Trudy Bush Valentine. Next up in Wisconsin, this is the race that we saw at the very beginning of the video. Ron Johnson, who's running for his third term in office, has a 63% chance at winning re-election. Mandela Barnes, the Democratic lieutenant governor, only has a 40% chance at flipping this seat. And so the odds between the two candidates were so close at one point that only 1 cent separated the shares between Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes. The numbers do add up to slightly over 100 because of rounding, but as of right now, the odds have gone up slightly for the Republican incumbent. Ron Johnson currently has a 62% chance, 63 today, of winning. And if you look at the polls here, it's because of the fact that Ron Johnson has led in the 4 most recent polls. In 3 of them, Johnson only led by 1 point, but this most recent poll funded by the National Republican Senatorial Committee does show Johnson up by 4, but of course this is an internal poll for the GOP. The latest Trafalgar Group poll still has Mandela Barnes leading by 2%. So according to betting markets right now, Wisconsin is back to being a lean Republican state, but Ron Johnson is still very, very vulnerable. 538 still has Wisconsin as a toss-up. Ron Johnson has a 56% chance at winning. And again, going down to the very bottom of the list here, we see that Wisconsin is the most competitive race of the year, more competitive than elections in states like Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. And that's how you know that Republicans are not in the same position that they were in just a few months back. They're now struggling to defend seats that they should win pretty easily. So Wisconsin is going to be a lean state on our map, with Ron Johnson still favored to win re-election. In Ohio, we have a race that we really should not even be talking about too much, but J.D. Vance is running such a poor campaign that Tim Ryan has a 1 in 4 chance at becoming the successor to Rob Portman. Rob Portman, the incumbent Republican, who won by 21 points against a former governor, that being Ted Strickland, in 2016. So looking at the betting markets here, the odds have gone up for Tim Ryan over the last couple of months, and if you look at his odds before this, at one point, Tim Ryan had a less than 10% chance at flipping in the seat. But despite Ohio being a very red state, Trump, of course, won the state in both of his presidential runs by over 8%. The Ohio polls right now favor Tim Ryan. Most of the polls have shown Tim Ryan defeating J.D. Vance. Now, the thing here is that the polls that have shown Ryan ahead are not exactly polls with the best methodology. If you look at the polls with the higher ratings, they have shown Vance with a slight lead. But even if J.D. Vance wins by 3%, 4%, it will still be a disappointing victory for the GOP. The 538 forecast right now only has Ohio as a lean Republican state, Vance with a 70% chance at winning. Honestly, it should be over 90. Ohio should almost be a solid state if you just ran a generic Republican against a generic Democrat. Now, Tim Ryan being a good candidate does not really help Republicans either. Even if you did have a generic Republican running, Tim Ryan is still a pretty electable Democrat. He is a pretty moderate member of his party, and that makes him more appealing to Ohio independents. And if you look at his odds, they have almost tripled in the last 3 months, or over tripled in the last 3 months. At one point, Tim Ryan only had a 10% chance at winning. Now he has a 30% chance at winning. So the election in Ohio has gone from being a 10-point race for the GOP all the way now down to just being a 3-point race. And so Ohio, according to the betting markets, is going to barely be a likely state for the GOP, with J.D. Vance having a 75% chance at winning his first 6-year term. And the final Rust Belt race to go over is, of course, in Pennsylvania, in the Keystone State. John Fetterman is running against Mehmet Oz. Fetterman has a 69% chance at being elected. Of course, John Fetterman is the incumbent lieutenant governor serving under Tom Wolf. Looking at the latest numbers here, John Fetterman's odds have increased significantly over the last 3 months. For a very long time, Mehmet Oz was expected to win. Even though Mehmet Oz was not exactly the best candidate, John Fetterman has maintained a very strong lead in the polls. He's up by 9 9.5% and has led in every single poll that has ever been released for this race. Not a single poll has shown any Republican leading over John Fetterman. Even Sean Parnell never led against the Democratic Lieutenant Governor, and especially Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz has been behind every single time by double digits in many of these polls, and so with a spread like this, Mehmet Oz is not going to win this race. Even the Trafalgar Group has Fetterman up by 2, and the most Republican pollster in the entire country, having Democrat up by 2 points, basically guarantees their win. 538 gives John Fetterman an 82% chance at winning, so significantly higher than the betting markets. And if you look at the odds here, at one point, Mehmet Oz had a 65% chance at winning. This was Mehmet Oz's race to lose, and right now it looks like he is losing it. John Fetterman is currently projected to win by 6.3%, a likely margin for the Democratic Party. And so the betting markets, though, do still have Pennsylvania as being lean, as John Fetterman does not have a over 75% chance at winning, but still a very good market here for Democrats. John Fetterman is going to win this race. I'm pretty confident in that fact. And so according to the markets, though, Pennsylvania is going to be a lean state for the Democrats. And moving on to the only competitive Senate election that we have in New England, so we've gone over all 5 of the Midwestern races. Republicans are ahead in 4 of them, with only Pennsylvania currently expected to go to a Democrat. But of course, this seat is held by incumbent Republican Pat Toomey, so it will be a pretty big deal if Democrats can flip it. But in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan is running for re-election to a second term. She is being challenged by Republican Don Bolduc. Bolduc is down by 6.1% in the polls. He won his primary just less than a week ago against Chuck Morse. It was a very close race, but Morse would have been a better nominee. Chuck Morse is the only Republican candidate to have ever led in a poll against Maggie Hassan throughout this entire election cycle. According to the University of New Hampshire back in April, Morse was up by 2. Every single poll between Hassan and Bolduc has shown the incumbent Democrat in the lead. And so Republicans did make a mistake by electing Bolduc to be their candidate. If you look at the odds for Maggie Hassan, they went up the day that Hassan was confirmed to be challenged by Bolduc, and the odds for her have been on the rise for a couple of months now. The race at one point was barely a state that Democrats were favored in. 538 also sees a similar trend, with Maggie Hassan currently having an 85% chance of winning, so even better than Pennsylvania. And if you look at the odds before, it was a much closer election. So New Hampshire is going to be a likely state based on both the 538 forecast and the betting market. Now we're left with just 3 more races in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, the 3 competitive states in the Southeast. So starting off with North Carolina, Richard Burr is retiring after this term, despite being reelected by 6 points in 2016 against Deborah Ross. Now if you look at the betting markets here, Ted Budd has a 71% chance at succeeding his Republican predecessor. However, his odds have gone down quite a bit in the last 3 months. The odds for Sherry Beasley has doubled. She now has a 30% chance at winning. Previously, she was only at 14 or 15 at one point. And so Democrats went from being heavily underestimated in this election to now really standing a chance. The polls do show Sherry Beasley in the lead. She's up by 0.4% on average and has maintained this lead since the beginning of this month. So Ted Budd is really not looking as strong as he was before. For quite a while, he was up by likely margins in the polls. The margin did dip down in June, but he was still maintaining the lead until the beginning of the month of August, when Sherry Beasley took a very slight lead in the polling. And so as of right now, Ted Budd is still leading in most of the more reputable polls, but the Trafalgar Group having Budd up by 3% means that this race is going to be very competitive. The 538 forecast currently gives Ted Budd a 62% chance at winning, 38 for Sherry Beasley, so slightly better for Budd in the betting markets than it is according to this forecast, but North Carolina is going to be a lean Republican state according to where the money is. In Georgia, this is becoming one of the most competitive Senate elections this year. For quite a while, it looked like Raphael Warnock was doing pretty well, but the most recent polls have shown Herschel Walker in a stronger position than before. Herschel Walker led in many of the polls that were released in August. Every single poll conducted fully in the 8th month of this year has shown Herschel Walker leading. However, the 4 out of the 5 most recent polls do have Warnock ahead. So right now, Warnock still does maintain a lead in the polling, but definitely he is not perceived as being as strong as he was before. That's why his odds have gone down, even though he has a 54% chance at winning. At one point, he had a 63% chance at winning during the end of the summer. And if you look at the odds before, though, Herschel Walker was the candidate to beat for a very long time. This was his race to lose, just like it was in states like Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina. We're seeing a significant shift in favor of the Democrats overall, even though Warnock's odds have gone down just slightly in the last couple of weeks. Many elections are becoming a lot more competitive. Races that Republicans for quite a while had a significant advantage in throughout 2021 and early 2022. But of course, as Democrats are becoming more favored nationwide, we're seeing many of these races become more favorable for the Democratic Party. 538 currently gives Raphael Warnock a 56% chance of winning, so very similar to the betting markets. And so North Carolina, according to the markets, just like Nevada, is going to be a tilt Democratic state. The ratings right now in Nevada and Georgia are exactly the same as my very own ratings, according to my last prediction. And if I had to make one today as well, I would have both of these states as being tilt Democratic too. And finally, in Florida, Marco Rubio has an 86% chance at winning a third term in office. Val Demings, Democratic challenger, has a 15% chance at winning this race. And if you look at the odds over the last couple of months, you'll see a very slight increase for Val Demings. She went from 7 all the way up now to 16, but really not that much of a difference. Her odds are still relatively low. The markets, though, do show a pretty different story to the polls. The polls have this race as pretty close. Rubio is only up by 3.9%. If you look at many of the older polls, Rubio maintained a 20-point lead in some of these against Val Demings. This race has definitely become a lot closer than it was before. The most recent polls show Val Demings only down by single digits, and sometimes she is almost even close to tying Rubio. But as of this point, Marco Rubio is still heavily favored in Florida. 538 gives him an 86% chance at winning, so very close to what the betting markets currently show. Pretty much the exact same odds for Rubio. So Florida is going to be a likely Republican state, and the final state that we go over on this map. And so this is the 2022 Senate map based on the betting markets. 51 seats for the Democrats, 49 for the Republicans. And whenever I normally go over these types of maps based on polls, betting markets, or things like that, I normally don't agree with the maps, especially when they're according to the polls, as of course Democrats have the lead in Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina as well, but I simply don't believe that they're going to win these 3 races at all. However, the map here based on the betting markets, I think, is a very realistic map, and I agree with many of these calls. I have Pennsylvania and Arizona both as lean Democratic states. I don't think they're going to be likely, and I do have Nevada and Georgia currently as being tilted for the Democratic Party. I think they have a very slight edge in these races, but these 2 states can definitely flip Republican depending on what happens in the next couple of months. So that'll be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below. Do you agree with this map? Do you think Democrats will hold on to seats in Nevada and Georgia? And do you think Republicans will be able to win in Wisconsin and North Carolina, and especially Ohio, where JD Vance is, of course, running? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.